I drove 7 hours for New Year's. My sister opened the door, laughed, and said, "This year's just for family." I turned around without a word. 15 minutes later, her husband accidentally texted me, "Why would that loser even show up?" I smiled, logged in, and terminated every payment I covered. By sunrise, I got 68 missed calls and one message: "We need to talk." I, 32M, had been driving for 7 hours straight through the December snow, my hands cramping around the steering wheel as I navigated the winding mountain roads to my sister's house. The radio played the same recycled New Year's Eve countdown specials, but I barely heard them over the anticipation building in my chest. This would be the first family gathering I'd attended in 2 years, and I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, things could finally go back to how they used to be. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister earlier that morning, confirming I was still coming and asking me to bring champagne. I'd stopped at 3 different stores to find the expensive brand she specifically requested, the same one we'd shared during better times when our family still felt whole. The back seat was loaded with gifts I'd carefully selected over weeks of online shopping, wrapped in paper that matched the color scheme she'd mentioned wanting for her decorations. The GPS announced my arrival as I pulled into the familiar driveway, noting how much larger the house looked now compared to my cramped apartment across the state. Her husband's luxury car sat gleaming in the garage, a stark reminder of the financial gap that had grown between us over the years. I grabbed the champagne and a few of the lighter gifts, deciding to leave the rest until after I'd been welcomed inside. My sister answered the door within seconds of my knock, almost as if she'd been watching from the window. But instead of the warm embrace I'd been hoping for, she took one look at me and started laughing. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy or surprise, but something cold and mocking that made my stomach drop immediately. She told me that this year was just for family, her voice carrying that particular tone of dismissal I remembered from childhood arguments. The words hit me like a physical blow, especially coming from someone who'd spent months encouraging me to make the drive and join them for their annual celebration. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, holding the champagne and gifts like some kind of rejected door-to-door salesman, waiting for her to clarify or explain what she meant. But her expression remained unchanged, that same cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth while she waited for my response. Without saying a word, I turned around and walked back to my car. My hands were shaking as I tossed the champagne into the passenger seat, hearing it roll around as I backed out of the driveway. The gifts remained scattered across the back seat, suddenly feeling like evidence of my own stupidity rather than gestures of love. I made it exactly 15 minutes down the road before my phone buzzed with a text notification. Expecting maybe an apology or explanation from my sister, I glanced at the screen while stopped at a red light. Instead, I saw a message from her husband, clearly intended for someone else entirely. The text asked why that loser would even show up, followed by a string of laughing emojis and some additional commentary about my appearance and the beat-up condition of my car. He'd obviously meant to send it to whoever they'd been gossiping with about my anticipated arrival, but his careless finger had selected my name instead. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and read the message 3 more times, each pass making my chest burn hotter with a mixture of humiliation and rage. The casual cruelty of it, the way they'd apparently been discussing and mocking my visit before I'd even arrived, made everything suddenly crystal clear. Sitting in that parking lot with snow falling around my car, I found myself smiling for the first time in hours. Not because anything was funny, but because I just realized exactly how much power I'd been giving away without even thinking about it. You see, over the past 5 years since our parents died, I'd been quietly covering a significant portion of my sister's monthly expenses. It had started during the initial grief period when she'd been struggling to manage their mortgage payments on top of her own bills. What began as temporary assistance had gradually evolved into a permanent arrangement that neither of us discussed openly anymore. I'd been paying her car insurance, covering her phone bill, and sending monthly transfers that helped bridge the gap between her husband's inconsistent freelance income and their actual living expenses. The amounts had grown larger over time as their lifestyle had expanded, but I'd never questioned it because she was my only remaining family. My phone was still in my hand, and I realized I had access to everything right there through various banking and utility apps I'd set up over the years. Account passwords I'd helped create, automatic payments I'd established, and subscription services I'd added her to without ever thinking about the implications. I started with the car insurance, logging into my account and removing her vehicle from my policy with a few taps of my finger. The monthly savings would be substantial, but more importantly, her coverage would lapse at midnight on New Year's Day unless she scrambled to find alternative arrangements. Next came the phone service, where I discovered I'd been paying for not just her line, but her husband's as well, plus some premium features they'd added without bothering to mention. I removed both numbers from my family plan, knowing their service would be suspended within hours once the system processed the change. The automatic bank transfers took slightly more effort to cancel, but I worked through each one methodically while snow accumulated on my windshield. Monthly payments that had totaled nearly $2,000. Money I'd been sending without fanfare or recognition for years while living in a tiny apartment and driving a car that apparently provided them with entertainment. I'd also been covering their Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Prime, and several other streaming services they'd asked to be added to over the years. Each cancellation gave me a small surge of satisfaction, knowing they'd be locked out of their entertainment options within the next billing cycle. Their home security system was another monthly expense I'd taken over during a particularly difficult financial period for them. I canceled that service too, along with the cloud storage subscription they'd been using to back up their photos and the premium meal delivery service they'd become accustomed to ordering twice weekly. By the time I'd finished working through my phone, I'd eliminated nearly $3,000 in monthly support I'd been providing without them even acknowledging my contributions. The silence in my car felt different now, less like defeat and more like liberation. I drove home slowly through the worsening weather, stopping at a diner halfway back to grab coffee and a sandwich while I processed what had just happened. The waitress was friendly and talkative, asking about my New Year's plans and commenting on how far I'd apparently driven based on the snow accumulation on my car. I told her I'd had a change of plans and was heading home early, which seemed to satisfy her curiosity. She refilled my coffee twice and didn't rush me, even though the place was nearly empty and she was probably eager to finish her shift and start her own celebrations. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally got back, but also more peaceful. I spent the evening watching old movies and ordering Chinese takeout, occasionally checking my phone to see if any of the cancellations had triggered notifications on their end yet. The first missed call came at 11:37 p.m., just 23 minutes before the new year officially arrived. My sister's name flashed on the screen, followed quickly by two more calls in rapid succession when I didn't answer. Her husband tried calling next, then my sister again, then both of them in alternating patterns that continued well past midnight. I silenced my phone and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in months despite the constant buzzing from their increasingly desperate attempts to reach me. When I woke up the next morning, my phone showed 68 missed calls spread between my sister, her husband, and several numbers I didn't recognize. The voicemails were a progression from confused to angry to panicked as they realized the scope of what had been removed from their lives overnight. But it was the final text message that made everything worthwhile. My sister, who'd spent years taking my support for granted and apparently mocking me behind my back, had sent a simple message early that morning telling me we needed to talk. I made coffee and breakfast before responding, taking my time to craft something appropriately brief. I told her that family was just for family, echoing her words from the previous evening, and that I'd decided to focus my resources on people who actually wanted me around. Her response came within minutes, a long paragraph about misunderstandings and how I was being too sensitive about what had obviously been some kind of joke. She insisted that I'd taken everything out of context and was overreacting to a situation that could easily be resolved with a simple conversation. I replied that context seemed pretty clear from where I was sitting, especially given her husband's accidental honesty about their real opinions. I told her that I'd spent years trying to help them build a stable life, but that I was done being treated like an ATM that occasionally required social maintenance. The call started again immediately after I sent that message, but I was already getting dressed for my New Year's Day plans. I decided to drive to the nearby city and treat myself to a nice dinner, maybe catch a movie, and generally enjoy the first day of what felt like a completely different life. Update 1. 3 days later, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. I watched from my window as she sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes before finally approaching my door, probably trying to decide what approach would be most likely to succeed. She knocked softly at first, then more insistently when I didn't respond immediately. When I finally opened the door, she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. Her usual polished appearance had been replaced by something more desperate and disheveled. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her inside mostly out of curiosity about what kind of argument she'd prepared. She spent the first 10 minutes apologizing for the way she'd handled New Year's Eve, claiming that she'd been stressed about hosting and had reacted poorly to my unexpected arrival. I pointed out that my arrival had been confirmed multiple times and was hardly unexpected. She shifted tactics quickly, suggesting that there had been some family drama she'd been trying to protect me from, which was why she'd turned me away at the door. When I asked about her husband's text message, she claimed he'd been drinking and that his words didn't reflect their actual feelings. She insisted that they both valued my presence in their lives and had simply made some poor choices in how they'd expressed themselves. I listened to her entire presentation without interrupting, noting how carefully she avoided mentioning any of the financial support I'd been providing. She seemed to be operating under the assumption that I'd simply been upset about the social rejection and wasn't aware of how extensively I'd dismantled our financial arrangements. Finally, she asked what it would take for us to move past this misunderstanding and get back to normal. She suggested that we could start fresh in the new year and focus on rebuilding our relationship without letting pride get in the way of family bonds. I told her that I thought we already had moved past it, and that I was perfectly happy with the new normal I'd established. When she looked confused, I explained that I'd spent years providing financial support that went unacknowledged and apparently unappreciated, and that I decided to redirect those resources toward my own goals. The color drained from her face as she realized what I was telling her. She asked if I was really going to punish her financially over what she kept characterizing as a simple misunderstanding, as if the money had been some kind of gift she'd earned through good behavior. I corrected her, explaining that there was no punishment involved, just a reallocation of my resources toward people and causes that actually valued my contributions. I told her that she'd made it very clear that I wasn't really family in any meaningful sense, so it made perfect sense for me to stop funding their lifestyle. She tried several different approaches over the next hour, ranging from guilt to anger to promises about how different things would be moving forward. But I'd had several days to think about everything, and I was completely comfortable with my decision. Update 2. 2 weeks into January, I received a call from my sister's mother-in-law, someone I'd met only a handful of times at family gatherings. She explained that my sister had reached out to her family for help covering some unexpected expenses, and that she'd been given my number as someone who might have insight into the situation. I was polite, but didn't provide any details about our falling out or the financial changes I'd made. I simply told her that my sister and I had decided to establish better boundaries around money and support, and that they were now handling their expenses independently. The mother-in-law seemed to understand that there was more to the story than she'd been told, but she didn't press for details. She mentioned that my sister had seemed particularly stressed lately and wondered if there was anything that could be done to help stabilize their situation. I suggested that they might benefit from financial counseling or budgeting assistance, since they'd apparently been living beyond their means for quite some time. It wasn't meant as sarcasm, though I'm sure it came across that way. Around the same time, I started receiving friend requests and messages from mutual acquaintances who'd apparently heard some version of our story. My sister had been reaching out to anyone who might be willing to mediate or provide financial assistance, painting herself as the victim of my sudden and inexplicable cruelty. I didn't respond to most of these messages, but I did have coffee with one mutual friend who seemed genuinely concerned about both of us. She'd known our family for years and was confused about why our relationship had deteriorated so quickly. I gave her a brief overview of what had happened on New Year's Eve, including the accidental text message that had revealed my sister's true feelings. I also explained about the years of financial support that had gone unacknowledged and unappreciated. My friend was shocked to learn about the extent of the support I'd been providing, since my sister had never mentioned it during any of their conversations. In fact, she'd apparently been complaining regularly about money troubles without ever acknowledging that someone else had been helping to solve them. This friend offered to facilitate a conversation between my sister and me, but I declined. I explained that I'd already heard everything I needed to hear, both directly and accidentally, and that I was content with the boundaries I'd established. Update 3. By February, The consequences of my financial withdrawal had apparently become more serious than I'd initially realized. My sister's husband called me directly, which surprised me since we'd never had much of a relationship beyond polite family interactions. He apologized for the text message he'd sent on New Year's Eve, claiming it had been a moment of poor judgment that didn't reflect his actual feelings. He asked if there was any way we could work out some kind of arrangement that would help them get back on their feet. I told him that I appreciated the apology, but that the text message had simply confirmed what I'd already suspected about their attitudes toward me. I explained that I decided to focus my resources on my own future rather than continuing to subsidize their lifestyle. He tried to negotiate, suggesting that maybe I could restart just one or two of the payments to help them through a temporary rough patch. He promised that they would acknowledge my contributions more openly and include me more meaningfully in family activities. I declined his offer, but I did ask him a question that had been bothering me. I wanted to know how long they'd been making jokes about my appearance, my car, and my willingness to help them financially. I was curious whether the mockery had been going on for years or if it was something more recent. His silence told me everything I needed to know. After a long pause, he admitted that they'd occasionally made comments about my situation, but that it had always been meant affectionately rather than maliciously. I thanked him for his honesty and told him that I hoped they'd figure out their financial situation soon. I genuinely meant it, though I had no intention of being part of their solution. The last contact I had with either of them was a letter that arrived in late February. My sister had apparently decided that a more formal approach might be more effective than phone calls or surprise visits. The letter was 3 pages long and covered everything from childhood memories to promises about future family relationships. She acknowledged that they'd made mistakes in how they'd treated me and expressed genuine remorse for the pain they'd caused. But the core of the letter was still a request for me to reconsider my decision about the financial support. She detailed the specific hardships they were facing and explained how my assistance had been more crucial to their stability than I'd probably realized. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Not because I was trying to be cruel, but because I'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued. 3 months after that humiliating New Year's Eve experience, I was living in a larger apartment, driving a reliable car, and building an emergency fund that actually belonged to me. I'd started taking weekend trips and exploring hobbies I'd been putting off for years while my money went elsewhere. I haven't spoken to my sister since February, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. Sometimes family means the people who love and respect you unconditionally, and sometimes it just means people who share your DNA and expect you to pay their bills. I've learned to tell the difference.